Ethan had never liked the lake house. As a boy, he'd spent only a handful of summers there, dragged along by his parents who thought it was important for him to spend time with family. The house itself was beautiful in its own right. A wide wooden porch stretched toward the water, shutters painted in fading green, tall pines casting long shadows across the glassy surface of the lake. But beauty didn't erase the unease. Even as a child, Ethan had noticed something strange about his aunts, Clara and Miriam. They weren't cruel, nor were they unkind. But they carried a weight around them, a silence that was heavier than words, a secrecy that pressed into the walls of the house. Now at 27, Ethan hadn't seen them in years, which was why the invitation had surprised him. "Come stay with us for the summer. We'd love the company," the letter had read, signed in Miriam's delicate handwriting. At first he'd almost ignored it, but something in the neat slant of the words had tugged at him, a quiet pull he couldn't explain. And so weeks later he found himself driving down the winding dirt road, the trees closing in on either side, the lake appearing like a mirror in the distance. When he pulled up, both aunts were waiting on the porch. Clara was the first to greet him. Tall, still striking even in her 50s, she had sharp features softened only by the smile she forced across her face. Miriam, smaller and frilier, stood beside her with her hands clasped in front of her, her gray eyes flickering with something Ethan couldn't place. "You've grown," Clara said as she hugged him, her perfume faint but old, like something kept too long in a drawer. "Of course he's grown," Miriam whispered, her smile wavering. "He's a man now." Ethan chuckled awkwardly, taking in the familiar smell of pine and damp wood as they ushered him inside. The air felt heavy just as he remembered. The same lace curtains, the same grandfather clock, ticking too loudly in the silence. The first days passed quietly. Ethan tried to relax. He read on the porch. He helped Miriam tend to the small garden behind the house. He accompanied Clara on errands to the nearby town. But beneath every routine, he felt something off. At dinner, conversations faltered into silence too often. Clara would glance at Miriam before answering even the simplest of questions, as if weighing what could be said. Miriam, for her part, always seemed distracted, her gaze flickering toward the window, toward the lake, toward the locked door at the end of the hall upstairs. That door. Ethan noticed it the second night. He had wandered the upstairs hallway, half remembering the layout from childhood. Bedrooms, bathroom, linen closet. But at the very end, a door, painted white but chipped, the brass knob dulled with age. When he reached for it, Miriam's voice had startled him from behind. "That room's not for guests." She stood at the top of the stairs, her face pale, her hands gripping the railing as though she needed it to stay upright. Ethan let his hand fall. "Sorry. I didn't mean." "It's fine," she said quickly, too quickly. "Just stay out, please." That night, lying awake, Ethan heard footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, passing his door. Then a soft creak, as though that forbidden door had opened. And then whispering. He sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The whispers grew faint, then stopped. The silence afterward was even heavier than the sound had been. By the end of the first week, Ethan could no longer shake the sense that he had been invited here for a reason no one was telling him. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, he asked casually, "So, why did you want me to visit? After all these years?" Clara smiled, but her eyes didn't. "Family should spend time together, don't you think?" "Of course. It just feels sudden." Miriam's knitting needles clicked faster. "We're getting older, Ethan. We thought it might be nice. Before." She stopped herself. "Before what?" Ethan pressed. Clara cut in smoothly, too smoothly. "Before we get too old to enjoy it." She stood, brushing invisible dust from her skirt. Duh. But Ethan had seen the look Miriam gave her before she turned away. A look of fear. Later that night, when Clara had gone to bed, Miriam lingered in the kitchen, rinsing dishes. Ethan joined her quietly. "Aunt Miriam," he said gently. "What's going on here?" She froze, the plate in her hand slipping back into the water. Her lips parted as if to speak, but then she shook her head. "Some things are better left buried," she whispered. Her words sent a chill down his spine. The longer Ethan stayed, the more he became obsessed with that upstairs door. Why was it locked? Why did Miriam guard it so closely? Why did Clara pretend it wasn't even there? On the 10th night, when the house was silent and both aunts had gone to bed, Ethan crept into the hall. He paused outside the door, his heart thundering. Slowly, carefully, he pressed his ear against the wood. At first, nothing. Just the silence of an old house. Then a faint sound. Like humming. Low and broken, as though someone on the other side was trying not to be heard. Ethan's blood ran cold. He reached for the knob, testing it gently. Locked. But as he pulled away, the humming stopped. Replaced by something worse. A whisper. Right against the other side of the door. Ethan. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over himself. His name. Whispered in a voice that wasn't Clara's, wasn't Miriam's. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Ethan sat across from Clara at the breakfast table. Miriam was absent, claiming she wasn't feeling well. Clara stirred her coffee, her expression distant, as if she were rehearsing thoughts she couldn't quite voice. Ethan couldn't hold back anymore. What's in that room upstairs? The clink of her spoon against porcelain stopped. Clara looked at him slowly, her eyes sharp, assessing. What room? The one at the end of the hall. Oh, her smile came quickly, too quickly. Storage. Old things we don't use anymore. Forgotten clutter. But Ethan remembered the whisper. His name. That was no clutter. Why keep it locked, he pressed. She met his gaze. Her smile didn't waver, but her hand tightened around the coffee cup so hard he thought the porcelain might crack. Curiosity is dangerous, Ethan, she said finally. Especially in this family. And that was the end of the conversation. It wasn't Clara who cracked first. It was Miriam. That evening, while Clara went into town, Miriam knocked softly on Ethan's door. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. You need to leave, she whispered. Ethan blinked. What? Why? This house, this family. It's not what you think. He leaned forward, his pulse quickening. Then tell me, what's behind that door? Tears spilled down Miriam's cheeks. I can't. She shook her head. If Clara knew I was even here saying this. Ethan grabbed her hand. Aunt Miriam, please. I deserve to know. Her lips trembled. For a moment, he thought she would tell him. But then, she pulled her hand free, backing toward the door. All I can say, she whispered, is that your parents didn't die the way you were told. And then she was gone. The words hit Ethan like a blow. His parents, killed in a car accident when he was 12. At least, that's what he'd been told his whole life. But Miriam's face had been certain, pained. So what was the truth? The obsession grew unbearable. Ethan waited until both aunts were asleep. Then, flashlight in hand, he crept up the stairs. His heart thundered as he stood before the locked door. The knob resisted, as always. But Ethan had prepared. He'd taken a thin metal skewer from the kitchen earlier, bent just enough to improvise as a lockpick. His hands shook as he worked it into the old brass lock. Click. The sound was so soft, yet so loud in the silence of the house. Ethan pushed the door open. The smell hit him first. Stale air, dust, and something metallic, faint but unmistakable. Blood? He stepped inside. The room was small, bare, except for a single wooden trunk against the far wall. A thin layer of dust coated everything. But what froze Ethan was the writing on the walls. Faded, but still visible names. His father's name. His mother's. His own. Scrawled over and over again, as though someone had scratched them into the plaster in moments of desperation. His flashlight trembled in his grip. Slowly he approached the trunk. His fingers hesitated on the latch before lifting it. Inside, photographs. Dozens, maybe hundreds, stuffed haphazardly. His parents younger. Clara, Miriam. All together, smiling in some, tense in others. And then, the photos grew darker. His parents, looking distraught. His father arguing with Clara. His mother with bruises on her arms. At the bottom, Ethan found a newspaper clipping. Local couple killed in car accident, survived by son. But someone had circled the headline in red ink. And beneath it, in shaky handwriting, Ethan. The voice froze him in place. He turned slowly. Clara stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes burning with something between fury and fear. You weren't supposed to see this, she said softly. Ethan swallowed hard. What happened to my parents? Clara stepped into the room, her hands clenched at her sides. They weren't killed in an accident. They wanted to leave. To take you with them. But this family, she stopped herself, shaking her head. What family? Ethan demanded. Her lips curled in a bitter smile. You think you know where you come from? You don't know anything. Your parents tried to run. And they paid the price. Ethan's chest tightened. Are you saying they're dead because they betrayed us? Clara hissed. And Miriam's too weak to admit it. Ethan's voice broke. You killed them. Clara's eyes flashed. We protected what had to be protected. And you, she pointed a trembling finger at him. You were never supposed to find out. Later that night, Miriam found Ethan on the porch, his face pale, his hands shaking. She sat beside him. Her frail frame bent as though the weight of decades pressed upon her shoulders. She told you, didn't she? Miriam whispered. Not everything, Ethan said, his voice hollow. Just enough to know I've been lied to all my life. Miriam closed her eyes. Your parents wanted to leave. They discovered things about our family. About Clara. About the way she kept control. Her voice trembled. They were planning to take you far away. To cut ties completely. But Clara wouldn't allow it. That night, by the lake, there was no car accident. Clara made sure they never left. The night air grew colder, heavier. Ethan could barely breathe. And me. His voice was barely a whisper. Why invite me here now? Miriam's tears fell silently. Because Clara doesn't trust me anymore. She wanted you here. To choose a side. The following days blurred together. Ethan moved through the house like a ghost, the weight of truth crushing him. Clara pretended nothing had changed, serving meals, making small talk. But her eyes never left him, sharp and calculating. Miriam grew quieter, paler, as if confessing had drained the last of her strength. And Ethan could no longer tell if the house itself was suffocating him, or if it was simply the truth. One evening, Clara cornered him in the study. You're one of us, Ethan, she said, her voice urgent. Blood doesn't lie. Your parents were weak. They didn't understand what family means. But you can carry this forward. You can stay. Take your place. Ethan stared at her, bile rising in his throat. My place, he said bitterly. Or your prisoner? Clara's face hardened. Be very careful, Ethan. Without me you have nothing. He thought of the photos, the bruises, the lies. And for the first time, he felt something stronger than fear. Resolve.